All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
The salt of the Pacific is a taste I've come to associate with lies. It's there on my lips, a sharp mineral tang as I stare at the impossible line item on the screen of my phone. Daniel is in the shower, singing off-key to some classic rock anthem, the sound muffled by the roar of water and the trade winds rustling the palms outside our rented villa. Paradise. That's what this was supposed to be. A second honeymoon, a desperate attempt to stitch back together the fraying edges of us over the last 12 months. My phone had died and I needed to print our boarding passes for the flight home tomorrow. His laptop was on the bamboo desk, open, beckoning. He'd never minded me using it before. Password is still our dog's name, the one we got 10 years ago, the one that died 2 summers back. A relic of a simpler time. The browser was already open to our bank's website. A habit of his, a constant, anxious monitoring of our finances that I'd always found endearing, a sign of his care for our stability. My eye caught it immediately. A charge from 2 days before we flew out. A restaurant. La Mer Étoilée. 247-286. The number itself was a grenade. A fancy dinner. Without me. I felt a coldness seep into my gut. A stark contrast to the humid Hawaiian air. I clicked it. The details expanded. The date. The time, 7,000. A Wednesday. He told me he was working late, finalizing a project for a client who was being difficult. I'd eaten leftover pasta alone, watching reruns of a sitcom I didn't find funny. My fingers, gone clumsy and numb, navigated to the statement from the previous month. Another charge, the same restaurant. And the month before that, a pattern, a rhythm of deceit set to the tune of fine dining. The shower stopped. The singing ceased. The only sound was the frantic thrumming of my own heart against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. I could hear him moving in the bathroom, the scrape of the glass door, the rustle of a towel. My mind, usually so precise, so adept at drafting order from chaos, began to fracture. It wasn't just the money. It was the detail. Daniel was a steak and potatoes man. His idea of a romantic dinner was the burger place down the street that did truffle fries. La Mer Étoilée was French. Pretentious. It was everything he claimed to hate. He emerged from the steam, a towel around his waist, his skin pink from the hot water. He smiled at me, a genuine, easy smile that once could melt the ice of my worst moods. Now, it looked like a prop, a mask worn by a stranger. "What's up, babe? All set for tomorrow?" he asked, running a hand through his wet hair. I couldn't speak. I could only turn the screen of the laptop toward him. The movement was slow, deliberate, like aiming a weapon. I watched his face. I saw the smile freeze, then crack. I saw the blood drain from his cheeks, leaving a pallor that was ghastly under his tan. I saw the flicker in his eyes, panic, calculation, and finally a devastating, resigned guilt. It was the guilt that did it. The confirmation. It wasn't a mistaken charge. It wasn't a business dinner. It was a secret. It was a life, a parallel universe running alongside ours, funded by our joint account. "Scarlett," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. I can explain. But he couldn't. There was no explanation that could unbreak this. The world, our world, the one I had blueprinted and built with him over 12 years, shattered in the space between his smile and his guilt-ridden stare. The sound of the ocean outside, once soothing, now sounded like a monstrous, mocking applause. I was standing in the heart of paradise, and I had never felt more cold, more alone, or more utterly, completely betrayed. The flight home was a 20-hour wake in a pressurized metal tube. We didn't speak. The space between our seats was a canyon filled with the ghosts of everything we hadn't said. He tried once, somewhere over the vast, dark emptiness of the Pacific. A whispered, "I'm so sorry, Scarlett." It didn't mean anything. The words were so cliché, so insultingly cheap, that I actually flinched. It meant everything. It meant our entire marriage was a joke he'd been telling behind my back. "Don't," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the tremor I felt in my soul. "Just don't." He retreated into a sullen silence, and I turned my face to the window, watching the endless blue below. My mind, usually a organized blueprint of plans and solutions, was a pile of rubble. I am an architect. I build things. I create order from raw materials. And my life's work, the structure I had dedicated 12 years to, had just been condemned with a single glance at a bank statement. The cab ride from SeaTac was just as silent. The evergreen trees lining the highway, usually a welcome sight of home, looked like dark, judging sentinels. Our house in Bellevue, a modern two-story I had designed myself, loomed as we pulled into the driveway. It didn't feel like a homecoming. It felt like walking onto a crime scene. The door clicked shut behind us, and the echo in the pristine, open-concept living room was deafening. Our son, Leo, was still at my sister's for the rest of the week. The silence was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Daniel dropped his bag by the door, a familiar gesture that now felt like an invasion. He turned to me, his shoulders slumped. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice raw. The question hung in the air. I walked to the large floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the backyard, the one I'd insisted on for the light. I crossed my arms, hugging myself tight. "You tell me everything," I said, my back to him. "You start from the beginning. And you do not lie to me. Not one more time." I heard him sink onto the leather sofa, the cushion sighing under his weight. And then he started talking. His voice was a monotone, a rehearsed confession. Her name was Elena. They dated briefly in college. They reconnected on Facebook 6 months ago. It started with messages, then coffee for old time's sake, then lunches, then dinners at La Mer Étoilée. I listened, my body rigid, as he painted a picture of a parallel life. The details were mundane, which made them somehow more horrific. He remembered her birthday. He knew her favorite wine. He complained to her about me, about my long hours at the firm, about my obsession with everything being just so, about how I'd changed since Leo was born. Each word was a scalpel, meticulously dissecting our marriage. He wasn't just telling me about an affair. He was showing me all the cracks in our foundation I'd been too busy or too blind to see. He was giving me the receipts for the demolition of our life. When he finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. The sun had begun to set, casting long, accusing shadows across the polished concrete floors. "I ended it," he said finally. "The day before we left for Hawaii. I swear, Scarlett, it was over. I was going to focus on us. On fixing us." I turned around slowly. The man on my couch looked like my husband, but he was a stranger reciting lines from a bad play. "You ended it?" My voice was quiet, dangerously calm. "You don't get to be the hero who ends it. You don't get to focus on us after you set us on fire." I took a step toward him. "You were going to focus on us? In Hawaii? While you were lying next to me on the beach, were you thinking about her? When you kissed me, did you taste the ghost of her expensive wine?" He looked down at his hands, unable to meet my gaze. The guilt was gone, replaced by a defensive shame. "What do you want me to say?" I made a mistake. A huge, stupid, unforgivable mistake. "Unforgivable," I repeated, testing the word. It felt true and final. "Yes, I think it is." I walked to the bedroom, my movements robotic. I pulled his largest suitcase from the closet and threw it on the bed. I started opening drawers, pulling out his clothes, his shirts, his sweaters, his socks, and throwing them into the open case. I wasn't neat. I wasn't orderly. I was a storm of grief and rage. He appeared in the doorway, watching me, his face pale. "Scarlett, what are you doing?" "Stop. Let's just talk about this. We're done talking," I said, not stopping, not looking at him. "You can't stay here." "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, a hint of petulance in his voice. "To La Mer Étoilée," I shot back, the words laced with a venom I didn't know I possessed. "See if Elena has a couch. Or a hotel room charged to a secret credit card I don't know about." I zipped the suitcase closed, the sound definitive. I dragged it off the bed and rolled it to the front door, pushing it unceremoniously outside onto the porch. I held the door open. He stood there, stunned. This wasn't the script. I was supposed to cry. I was supposed to yell and then eventually, after a suitable amount of groveling, maybe, possibly, forgive him. I was not supposed to be this cold, this decisive. "Scarlett, please. Leo, what about Leo?" The mention of our child was a physical blow, but I didn't let it show. "We will figure out a way to be parents to him. But we will not do it as husband and wife. Not anymore. Now, please leave. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Fear of the woman I had become in the last 24 hours. The woman he had created. He picked up his bag, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and walked out into the cool Washington evening. I closed the door. I locked it. I engaged the deadbolt. The sound echoed through the empty, perfectly designed house. And then, for the first time since I'd seen that bank statement, I slid down against the door, buried my face in my hands, and sobbed. The structure had collapsed. And now, I was sitting alone in the dust. The silence after he left was a physical presence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping child, or the comfortable hush of a shared evening. It was a vacuum, sucking all the sound, all the life out of the house I had built. For 3 days, I moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting the shell of her own life. I'd pick up a book and put it down. I'd stand in front of the open refrigerator, seeing nothing. I'd jump at every creak of the floorboards, a Pavlovian response trained over 12 years, expecting to hear Daniel's key in the door. But he didn't come back. His texts were a stream of apologies, pleas, and finally, logistical questions about Leo. I answered only the ones about our son, my replies clipped and devoid of emotion. He's fine. He has a dentist appointment on Thursday. I'll let you know. The 4th day, I had to pick up Leo from my sisters. The moment I saw his small, earnest face light up, the dam inside me threatened to break. I had to be his rock. His world was already about to be shaken. I couldn't let him see me crumble. "Where's Daddy?" he asked, buckling himself into the car seat. "Daddy's on a work trip," I lied, the words ash in my mouth. It was the story we'd agreed on, a temporary measure that felt like just another layer of the betrayal. Life became a performance. I made pancakes. I helped with 2nd-grade math. I read bedtime stories about brave knights and clever princesses. I was playing the part of mom in a play called Everything is Fine, and I was exhausting myself with the effort. At night, after Leo was asleep, I'd wander the house. I'd trace the lines of the furniture I'd chosen, run my hands over the cool granite countertops I'd designed. This house was my masterpiece, and now every corner of it was a monument to my failure. To our failure. I started seeing the evidence everywhere. Not of the affair, but of the slow decay I'd been blind to. The book on his nightstand, he never read. The running shoes, pristine, bought during a short-lived fitness kick. The way his side of the closet was a little emptier than mine, as if he'd been slowly phasing himself out for months. The lowest point came on a Tuesday. It was raining, a classic Seattle drizzle that grayed out the world. Leo was at school. The house was silent. I was standing in the laundry room, holding a shirt of Daniel's that had been left behind. It still smelled like him, his shampoo, his faint, familiar scent. And instead of anger, a wave of such profound, debilitating grief washed over me that my knees buckled. I sank to the floor on the cold tiles, clutching the stupid shirt, and I cried. I cried for the man I thought he was. I cried for the future we had planned. I cried for my son, who would never again know the uncomplicated security of his parents' united love. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen slits. I stayed there for a long time, curled on the floor, empty. This was the bottom. This was the numb, hollowed-out core of it. The anger had burned off, leaving only the vast, desolate landscape of loss. It was the sound of the mail slot clattering, a pile of envelopes scattering on the floor in the hallway, that finally stirred me. I pushed myself up, my body aching, and went to collect it. Bills. Junk mail, a postcard. The postcard was for me. It was a stunning, almost unreal photograph of a vast black sand beach under a turbulent, dramatic sky. The aurora borealis snaked across the top in a brilliant green wave. On the back, it was from a former colleague, a free-spirited woman who had quit architecture to travel the world. Their message was short. "Scarlett, thought of you when I saw this. Iceland is pure, raw design. A masterpiece of nature. You'd love it. Hope you're building amazing things. Chloe." I stared at the image. The raw, untamed beauty of it, the violence and the serenity existing together. It was the absolute antithesis of my clean, ordered, controlled life. My life, which was now in ruins. Pure, raw design. The phrase stuck in my head. I looked around my perfectly designed home. It was a beautiful cage. I had built it to be a sanctuary, but it had become a museum of a life that was over. An idea, fragile and terrifying, began to form in the emptiness. A crazy, impulsive, utterly necessary idea. I couldn't fix this. I couldn't rebuild here, not surrounded by these ghosts. I needed to get out. I needed to go somewhere where the landscape was as broken and raw and beautiful as I felt. I needed to breathe air that Daniel had never breathed. I walked to my laptop, the same one that had brought the news of my destruction. I opened a browser. I didn't search for marriage counselors or divorce lawyers. Not yet. I typed 2 words into the search bar. And Reykjavik, Iceland. I booked a one-way ticket for the following week. I had no plan, no itinerary, no idea what I would do there. For an architect, a planner, a woman who lived by blueprints, it was the most insane thing I had ever done. And it was the first decision I'd made in weeks that didn't feel like dying. It felt like a desperate, gasping breath. The first one after a long submersion. The cold was the first thing that truly silenced the noise in my head. It wasn't the damp chill of a Seattle winter. This was a clean, sharp, elemental cold that scraped the inside of my nostrils and made the hairs in them freeze. It was a physical slap, and I welcomed it. The air in Keflavik airport smelled of sulfur and salt. A stark, alien scent that told every cell in my body that I was nowhere I had ever been with Daniel. I had no plan. My suitcase was filled with all the wrong clothes. I rented a ridiculously small car and, with hands trembling from exhaustion and a strange, buzzing anxiety, drove towards Reykjavik under a sky that was already beginning to think about dusk, even in the middle of the day. The landscape was breathtakingly barren. Lava fields covered in a thick, spongy moss stretched to black sand beaches where the North Atlantic waves crashed with a violence that was both terrifying and beautiful. There were no trees, no familiar landmarks. It was a world newborn, raw, and utterly indifferent to my personal tragedy. The sheer scale of it shrank my pain into something manageable, something small and human. I found a small, minimalist guest house on the outskirts of the city, a place of clean lines and glass that looked out onto the endless water. The owner, a woman with a kind, weathered face and eyes that held their own stories, didn't ask questions. She simply handed me a key and said, "The light is good for the soul here." Even in winter, the first 2 days, I did nothing. I slept for 14 hours straight. I ate soup from a corner cafe. I walked along the wind-whipped coast, the gale-force winds whipping my hair and tears from my eyes, the salt on my cheeks indistinguishable from the sea spray. I let the vast emptiness of the place fill me. I wasn't Scarlett, the betrayed wife, or the architect, or even Leo's mom. I was just a set of senses, buffeted by the weather. On the 3rd day, the purpose of my aimless trip found me. I was driving the ring road, no destination in mind, when the sky began to perform. It was mid-afternoon, but the heavens plunged into a deep, velvety indigo. And then it began. A faint, shimmering ribbon of green appeared on the horizon. It danced, ethereal and silent, slowly gaining strength, morphing into great, pulsing curtains of light that filled the entire sky. Violet and pink joined the green, a celestial ballet that was so profoundly beautiful it felt almost painful. I pulled the car over, stumbling out into the freezing night, my head thrown back. I was crying again, but this time, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of awe. This was the masterpiece Chloe had spoken of. This was pure, raw design on a scale I could never hope to emulate. And in that moment, under the swirling cosmos, I felt a desperate primal need to capture it. Not to understand it, not to draft it, not to build it. Just to hold a piece of this beauty, to prove I was here and I had witnessed it. My hands were shaking, numb with cold as I fumbled with my phone. The camera felt inadequate, a toy against this majesty. I took picture after picture, but the tiny screen couldn't capture the depth, the movement, the soul-shaking grandeur. It was futile. Frustration cut through the awe. This was why I was here, wasn't it? To feel something real. And this was the most real thing I had ever seen, and I had no way to keep it. The next morning, driven by a need I didn't fully understand, I walked into a small camera shop in Reykjavik. The bell on the door jingled. The man behind the counter looked up, his eyes crinkling. I pointed to a serious-looking camera with a long lens in the glass case. I need that, I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. I need to take a picture of the sky. He didn't laugh. He nodded slowly, as if my request was the most reasonable thing in the world. Or the lights, he said. They demand it. He spent the next hour with me, explaining apertures and ISO, shutter speeds and tripods. He sold me a sturdy, second-hand camera body and a lens that felt heavy and significant in my hands. It was an expensive, impulsive purchase. The kind of thing I would have agonized over for weeks, researching and comparing. Today, I just handed over my credit card. I spent the rest of the day in my room, reading the manual, watching tutorials online, my focus absolute. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Daniel, or the divorce papers waiting in my email, or the heartbreakingly confused texts from Leo. I was thinking about light, about composition, about capturing a fraction of a second of eternity. That night, I drove back to the same spot. I set up the tripod with clumsy fingers, my breath pluming in the freezing air. I looked through the viewfinder, the world reduced to a perfect rectangle. I adjusted the settings, my heart pounding with a nervous excitement I hadn't felt in years. This was my first step. Not to rebuild a life, but to simply observe a beautiful one. My finger hovered over the shutter button. The lights began to dance again. I took a breath, held it, and clicked. The camera whirred. I looked at the small preview screen. The image was dark, blurry, the green smear indistinct. A complete failure. A laugh burst out of me, sharp and genuine, echoing in the vast, empty landscape. It was the first real sound of joy I had made since Hawaii. I had failed, and it didn't matter, because I was here, trying. I was learning. I was alone under the magnificent, uncaring sky, and for the first time, alone didn't feel synonymous with lonely. It felt like a beginning. I adjusted the settings and tried again. Iceland didn't heal me. It gave me a project. The camera became my blueprint. The stark landscapes my empty plot of land. I extended my stay from a week to 2, then to a month. I sent a long, careful email to my sister, explaining more than I had to anyone, asking her to keep Leo for a little while longer. She, bless her, understood. Take the time you need, Scarlett. Just come back to him whole. Whole felt like an impossible destination, but functional? That I could work towards. My days fell into a new, solitary rhythm. I would wake, check the weather and aurora forecasts like a sailor reading the tides, and plan my expeditions. The camera was my constant companion, a heavy, reassuring weight against my chest. I learned its language, the click of the aperture ring, the solid thunk of the mirror. It was a language of precision and light, a welcome contrast to the messy, painful language of the heart. I chased the light, not just the otherworldly dance of the aurora, but the soft pink glow of the Arctic sunrise over a glacier, the way the low afternoon sun set the golden grass on fire against a backdrop of brooding volcanic mountains. I photographed waterfalls so powerful they shook the ground, freezing the motion of the water into a silken blur. I framed the lonely churches, small red dots against immense, monochrome landscapes. It was during these long hours of waiting, of watching the light change, that the thoughts would come. Not the debilitating waves of grief, but quieter, more analytical reflections. I'd replay moments from my marriage, not to torture myself, but to understand the structural flaws. The load-bearing walls I hadn't properly reinforced. The compromises I'd made that weakened the entire design. I saw how I'd let my own identity, Scarlett, the architect, be subsumed by Scarlett, the wife, and Scarlett, the mother. I had stopped building my own world and was merely furnishing ours. One afternoon, I found myself at a black sand beach, battered by wind and rain. The sea was a churning, furious gray. I set up my tripod, fighting to keep it steady, determined to capture the raw power of the waves crashing against the basalt columns. I took shot after shot, my fingers going numb, my lens spotted with rain. They were all terrible. The composition was off, the exposure was wrong, the entire scene was a flat, messy smear of gloom. Frustration boiled over. I wanted to scream at the ocean, at the sky, at the stupid, expensive camera that couldn't do what I needed it to do. This was a metaphor for my entire life. a messy, uncontrolled, failed exposure. I sank onto a wet rock, letting the rain soak through my supposedly waterproof jacket. I was about to pack it all in, to retreat to the warm, dry guilt of my guest house, when the sun broke through the clouds for a single, breathtaking minute. A shaft of golden light pierced the gray, illuminating the crashing wave at its very peak, turning the spray into a million glittering diamonds. It was a moment of sublime, violent beauty amidst the chaos. My hands moved on their own. I didn't think about aperture or shutter speed. I just raised the camera, framed the light, and clicked. I looked at the preview screen. My breath caught. There it was. The perfect shot. The terrifying power of the wave, frozen in time, but transformed by the alchemy of light into something beautiful. The darkness of the storm was still there, framing the light, giving it context and meaning. It wasn't a happy picture. It was a picture of struggle and beauty existing simultaneously. It was true. In that moment, I understood. This was my new foundation. Not the pursuit of happiness, not the avoidance of pain. It was about finding the composition within the chaos. It was about learning to see the light, even when it was surrounded by darkness. Photography wasn't just a distraction. It was a new way of seeing my own life. I started a blog. A simple, anonymous thing. I called it The Developing Room, a play on the photographic term and the personal one. I began posting my pictures, the failed ones, with notes on what I'd done wrong, and the successful ones, like the wave. I wrote short, sparse captions about the light, the location, the technical details. I never wrote about him. I never wrote about my broken heart. I wrote about the healing power of focus, of patience, of learning to see the world through a different lens. One evening, after posting a picture of the northern lights reflected in a perfectly still glacial lagoon, a notification popped up. A comment. My heart hammered, a ridiculous reaction to a stranger's words on the internet. The comment was in English. The clarity of this reflection is stunning. You've managed to capture the silence of this place. It's like looking into another universe. Thank you for sharing. It was signed simply, Mark. I clicked on the name. His profile was a landscape photographer from Colorado. His own work was incredible, grand, sweeping images of mountains and deserts, full of the same dramatic light I was drawn to. He wasn't just being nice. He knew what he was talking about. I typed a reply, my fingers clumsy. Thank you. It was 25 greasies. The silence was the loudest thing I've ever heard. A few minutes later, he replied, The cold is a small price to pay for a moment of perfection. Stay warm. I closed the laptop, a small, unfamiliar smile touching my lips. It was the first connection I'd made that was entirely about who I was becoming, not who I had been. It was a conversation between two photographers, not between a betrayed woman and a pitying stranger. I looked at the camera sitting on the desk. It was no longer just a tool for escape. It was a passport, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of excitement about where it might take me next. Returning to Seattle felt like stepping back into a ghost story. The house was too quiet, too full of echoes. The carefully chosen furniture, the art on the walls, the very light falling through the windows, it all belonged to a different woman. A woman who believed in the permanence of things. I had been cracked open in Iceland, and the person who came back didn't quite fit the mold of the person who had left. The hardest part was Leo. His small face, so full of confusion and a quiet hurt that broke me more than any tantrum could have. Why did Daddy move out? He asked one night, his voice small in the vastness of his bedroom. I sat on the edge of his bed, my architect's heart, which once dealt in concrete and steel, fumbling for the right words. Sometimes, I began, choosing each word like a stepping stone across a river. Even when two people love you very, very much, they can't live together anymore. It's not your fault. It's a grown-up problem. And Daddy and I both love you more than anything in the whole world. It was the script, the one the therapist I'd started seeing had suggested. It felt inadequate, a flimsy bandage on a deep wound. But his small hand found mine. Is that why you went to the cold place? Because of the grown-up problem? Yes, honey. Mommy needed to remember how to be strong. Did it work? I looked at his worried eyes, so much older than they should be, and made a decision. Let me show you. I brought my laptop into his room and opened my blog, The Developing Room. I scrolled through the pictures. The mighty waterfalls, the black sand beaches, the ponies with shaggy coats, the vast glaciers. His eyes grew wide. Whoa. Whoa. You took these? I did. He pointed to the shot of the wave, the one with the shaft of light. That one's cool. It looks like a dragon. I laughed, and it felt real. It does, doesn't it? In that moment, the blog wasn't just my secret therapy, it was a bridge back to my son. I was showing him a part of me he'd never seen. Not Mom the rule enforcer, or the homework helper, but Scarlett, the person who goes on adventures and takes pictures of dragon waves. This became our new ritual. After homework, before bed, we'd look at the new pictures I'd taken that day. I started seeing my city through the lens again, seeing it with the new eyes Iceland had given me. I took him on weekend photo walks. We'd go to Pike Place Market, and I'd show him how to frame the vibrant colors of the flower stalls, the determined focus of the fishmongers. He'd point with a small, excited finger. Take a picture of that, Mom. The light on the puddle. The camera, which had been my escape, was becoming my anchor. It was how I was rebuilding my relationship with my son, and how I was reclaiming my city, turning it from a place of pain into a canvas of new discoveries. The divorce proceedings began. It was a cold, bureaucratic unraveling of a 12-year life. Forms, asset divisions, parenting plans. Daniel and I met with lawyers, our interactions polite, distant, and unbearably sad. The man across the table was a stranger, and the process felt like the clinical dissection of a corpse. I signed where I was told to sign, my hand steady. The emotion was gone, burned away by the Icelandic cold and the focused heat of my new passion. One evening, after a particularly draining session with the lawyers, I felt the old emptiness threatening to creep back in. I put Leo to bed, waited until his breathing became deep and even, and then I went to my home office. But I didn't open my architectural software. I opened the raw image files from that day's walk with Leo. I had taken a picture of a single, resilient dandelion pushing through a crack in the sidewalk, backlit by the late afternoon sun. I loaded it into editing software, another new language I was learning. I adjusted the contrast, bringing out the delicate, almost translucent seeds. I darkened the shadows around it, making the flower stand out, a tiny hero in a concrete world. As I worked, focused entirely on the play of light and shadow, the noise of the day, the lawyer's dry voice, the weight of the paperwork faded away. There was only the image. There was only the process of making it perfect. This was my meditation, my therapy, my rage room, my marathon. This was my self-development. Not a dramatic, performative act of destruction, but a quiet, dedicated act of creation. Pixel by pixel, I wasn't just editing a photograph. I was reconstructing myself. I was learning that from the cracks in my life, something new and beautiful could indeed grow. The woman in the reflection of the computer screen, her face lit by the soft glow of the monitor, looked focused. She looked calm. She looked, for the first time in a long time, like herself. The rhythm of my new life was a quiet, steady metronome. Mornings were for Leo, making breakfast, packing lunches, the chaotic, loving rush to school. Days were for work. I'd thrown myself back into my architectural firm, but with a new perspective. My designs felt bolder, more attuned to the interplay of light and space, as if my photographer's eye was redrafting my blueprints. Evenings were for Leo again, for homework and stories. And nights were for me, for my camera, for the city that was slowly becoming mine again. My blog, The Developing Room, had become a quiet success. A small community of photography enthusiasts had gathered there, leaving encouraging comments and technical questions. I'd post a shot of the Seattle rain glittering on neon signs in Pioneer Square, or the intricate geometry of the Smith Tower against a moody sky, and they'd dissect the aperture settings. It was a language I was now fluent in. It was my secret identity. One rainy Saturday, with Leo at his father's for the weekend, the silence of the house felt heavy again. The legal separation was final, the divorce paperwork a looming mountain I'd have to climb soon. The ghost of my old life liked to whisper in these quiet moments. I needed to get out. To focus on something else. I drove to Elliott Bay Book Company, a place that had always been a sanctuary. The smell of old paper and ink was a constant in a world that had changed too much. About too much. I wandered the aisles, my fingers trailing over spines, feeling the familiar calm settle over me. I found myself in the photography section, looking for a specific monograph on Ansel Adams's early work. I saw it on the top shelf. As I reached for it, another hand reached for the same book at the exact same time. Our fingers brushed. "Oh, sorry," a man's voice said, warm and slightly surprised. I pulled my hand back, turning. "No, it's fine, you can." I looked up. He was tall, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners and a beard that had a few streaks of gray in it. He held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Ladies first, always. Especially when it comes to Ansel Adams. He's too important to fight over." I smiled, a little flustered. "It's for a project," I said, suddenly feeling the need to justify myself. "Me too," he said. "Well, a perpetual project. I'm always trying to figure out how he saw the world." He gestured to the book. "Please, I insist." I took the book. "Thank you." An awkward silence hung between us for a moment, filled only by the soft jazz playing in the bookstore. I should have just walked away. But something kept me there. He had a calm, grounded presence that felt safe. "Are you a photographer?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious, not just making conversation. The question sent a little thrill through me. "Yes," I wanted to say. "I am." "Trying to be," I said instead, moderating my enthusiasm. "It's a relatively new obsession." "The best kind," he grinned. "What do you shoot?" "Landscapes mostly." "Cityscapes. Light." The words tumbled out. "I just got back from Iceland." It was transformative. His eyes lit up with recognition and excitement. "No kidding? I was there last fall, chasing the aurora until my camera nearly froze solid. The light there is unreal, isn't it? It's like the air itself is clearer." We were talking. Actually talking. Not about the weather or the book, but about something that lived deep inside me. It was the easiest conversation I'd had in a year. "The silence was what got me," I found myself saying, echoing the comment I'd left on my blog months ago. "It's the loudest silence I've ever heard." He looked at me, and his expression shifted from friendly to something more thoughtful, more intrigued. There was a pause, a beat of recognition that I couldn't quite place. "That's a perfect way to describe it," he said softly. He extended his hand. "I'm Mark, by the way." The name hit me like a minor chord. Mark, the landscape photographer from Colorado. The one who had left the first comment on my blog. It couldn't be. The world wasn't that small. I took his hand. His grip was firm. Warm. "Scarlett," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Scarlett," he repeated, and I saw a flicker in his eyes. A question. He knew the name from somewhere too. From the watermark on my photos, perhaps? But he was too much of a gentleman to assume, to call me out on my secret identity in the middle of a bookstore. The moment stretched, charged with a strange electric potential. It was the thrill of a shared passion and the dizzying possibility of a coincidence that felt like fate. "Well, Scarlett," he said, finally letting go of my hand. "Since we're both after the same book and apparently the same light, can I buy you a coffee? There's a place next door." "We can, talk shop. I'd love to hear about your Iceland shots." My first instinct was to retreat. To make an excuse, to say I had to be somewhere. The walls I built around myself were high and strong. But I looked at him, at his open, honest face, at the easy way he held himself, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to be protected from a stranger. I took a breath, a small, brave breath into my new life. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like that a lot." The coffee shop was everything a Seattle coffee shop should be, warm, smelling of roasted beans and damp wool, filled with the soft hiss of the espresso machine and the low murmur of conversation. We found a small table in the corner, near the window where the rain made rivulets down the glass. I clutched my latte, the heat a grounding sensation against my palms. The initial, dizzying shock of the coincidence had settled into a low, humming nervousness. This was Mark, the one whose landscapes had made me catch my breath, whose thoughtful comment had been the first kind word from the outside world. And he was sitting across from me, real and solid, stirring a spoon in his black coffee. "So," he began, a small, easy smile playing on his lips. Iceland. Tell me everything the photos don't show, and so I did. The words came more easily than I expected. I told him about the cold that felt like a cleansing fire, about the sound of the glacier calving, a thunderous, ancient groan. I described the frustration of my first 1,000 blurry aurora shots and the sheer triumph of finally capturing one sharp, vibrant ribbon of light. I talked about the technical challenges, the long exposures, the battle with the elements to keep the lens dry. He listened, truly listened, his eyes never leaving my face. He didn't just nod, he engaged. What was your ISO set to for that waterfall shot you posted? The one with the silky water effect? The light was so perfect, I've never been able to get it quite right in overcast conditions here. He'd not only seen my photos, he'd studied them. He remembered them. A warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee spread through my chest. The conversation flowed effortlessly from focal lengths to favorite vantage points in the Cascades, from the merits of different filter brands to the best time of day to capture the moody atmosphere of the Puget Sound. It was a dance of shared passion, a language I'd only ever spoken to myself or to the anonymous void of the internet. To have someone speak it back to me, with such knowledge and enthusiasm, was intoxicating. But then a natural lull fell. The technical talk subsided. He looked at me, his expression softening. It takes a lot of courage to pick up a new craft like that, especially to go out alone in a place like Iceland. It's inspiring. The unspoken question hung in the air. Why? What prompted this? I looked down into my cup. This was the precipice. I could give him the sanitized version, the easy lie. I needed a creative outlet. I've always wanted to learn. Or, I could do the terrifying thing and be honest. The memory of Daniel's lies, the suffocating weight of that double life, rose up in me. I couldn't build anything new on a foundation of half-truths. Not even a friendship. I took a steadying breath and met his gaze. It was less about courage and more about necessity, I said, my voice quieter. My life fell apart last year, quite spectacularly. The camera was my life raft. I didn't elaborate. I didn't say my husband had an affair or I'm getting a divorce. I just stated the simple, brutal fact. My life had broken. And this, the photography, the chasing of light, was how I was keeping my head above water. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away with awkward pity. He just nodded slowly, his eyes holding a deep, understanding empathy. I'm sorry, he said, and the words were simple and sincere. Life rafts are important. I'm glad you found one that lets you create such beautiful things. He paused, then added with a gentle smile. The best art often comes from the repaired cracks, doesn't it? It was the perfect thing to say. It acknowledged the pain without dwelling on it, and it brought the conversation back to the safe, solid ground of our shared interest. He was offering me an out, a way to steer back to easier topics, but he was also letting me know he'd heard me. He'd seen the crack, and he wasn't afraid of it. We talked for another hour. He told me about his work as a freelance photojournalist, how he'd transitioned from news to landscapes after a decade of chasing conflict. I got tired of documenting the worst of people, he said. I wanted to document the best of the world. He was honest, self-deprecating, and incredibly interesting. When we finally stepped out onto the wet sidewalk, the rain had softened to a mist. The streetlights were haloed in the damp air. I should probably go, I said, though a part of me wanted to stay right there, talking about f-stops and life rafts forever. I'm glad we bumped into each other, Scarlett, he said, his hands in his pockets. Truly, he hesitated for a second, then asked, there's a small exhibit opening at the photo center next weekend. A friend of mine is showing some work. Would you be interested in going? A date. It was a date. My heart did a little flip-flop of panic and excitement. I hadn't been on a date since the Clinton administration. I thought of Daniel. I thought of the tangled mess of my life. But then I looked at Mark. At his honest eyes. He knew I was broken. He'd seen the crack, and he'd called it art. I'd like that, I said, and I realized I meant it. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Great, I'll text you the details. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the Seattle mist. I stood there for a long moment, the cool air on my face, feeling something I hadn't felt in a very, very long time. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was potential. a faint, delicate thread of light in the darkness, like the first hint of dawn. I had taken a terrifying step into honesty, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had offered me a ticket to a photo exhibit. The photo exhibit was a test. Not of him, but of me. Could I stand in a room with a man who wasn't Daniel and not feel like I was committing a crime? Could I make conversation that wasn't about parenting schedules or legal filings? Could I remember how to be just Scarlett, a woman with interests and opinions and not just a casualty of a broken marriage? Mark was waiting for me under the awning of the gallery, a black umbrella in his hand. He looked comfortable, in his own skin, in the drizzly evening, in this situation. He smiled when he saw me, a warm, genuine expression that eased some of the tightness in my chest. "You made it," he said, and it felt like an accomplishment. "I did," I replied, and managed to smile back. The exhibit was a series of stark, beautiful black and white portraits of fishermen from the Pacific Northwest. We moved slowly through the gallery, stopping before each image. We didn't talk much at first, just absorbed the art. But then he'd lean in and point out a technical detail. The way the light caught the grizzled texture of a man's beard, the composition that told a story of a hard life at sea without a single cliché. I found myself doing the same, pointing out the emotion captured in a subject's eyes. It was effortless. It was the conversation in the coffee shop, but deeper. We spoke the same visual language. He didn't try to impress me, he just shared his perspective, and listened to mine with a respect that felt intoxicating. Afterwards, we went to a quiet pub nearby. Over a shared plate of fries, the conversation drifted from photography to travel, to books, to the mundane absurdities of life. He made me laugh. Actually, laugh. A real, unforced sound that startled me coming from my own mouth. He was witty and self-deprecating, telling a story about a disastrous camping trip where he'd forgotten his tent poles. But woven through the lightness were threads of substance. He spoke about his family with affection, about his work with passion. He was solid, grounded. There were no games, no cryptic statements, no second layer to his words. His transparency was a balm on the paranoia Daniel's lies had left behind. This became our pattern. A text would come through. "There's a crazy sunset over the Sound. Heading to Discovery Park with my camera if you're free." Or I would see a photo he'd taken of the Fremont Troll and sent him a message. "You caught the light perfectly on the bronze. What time were you there?" We were two solitary figures, orbiting the same passion, slowly being pulled into each other's gravity. Our dates were photo walks. Our conversations were debates about prime lenses versus zooms. Our growing connection was documented in the images we shared with each other. One Saturday, he asked if I wanted to go on a day trip. "No destination," he said. "Just see where the road takes us." A photo adventure. The trust that required from me was immense. To get in a car with a man I still felt I barely knew, to cede control of the day, to embrace the unknown. The old me would have planned every mile, every stop, every contingency. The new me, the one with the camera who had learned to find beauty in the unplanned, hesitated for only a moment. "Yes," I said. "I'd love to." We drove east, towards the Cascades. We didn't have a goal, just a general direction. We stopped at a roadside stand for apples, at a forgotten cemetery where the moss-covered headstones made for hauntingly beautiful compositions. We pulled over simply because the light through the pine trees was too perfect to ignore. We were in a small town, its main street, a sleepy collection of old brick buildings, when we saw it. A flea market spilling out from a vacant lot, a chaotic jumble of treasures and junk. Without a word, we looked at each other and grinned. A shared mission. For the next hour, we lost ourselves in the hunt. He found a box of vintage camera lenses, filthy but potentially salvageable. I found a stack of old architectural blueprints from the 1920s. The paper yellowed and fragile, the lines precise and beautiful. We showed each other our finds like kids with pirate treasure. We were examining a bizarre ceramic owl when a sudden cold downpour sent everyone scrambling. We ran, laughing, back to the shelter of his car, slightly damp and breathless. The sound of the rain drumming on the roof enclosed us in our own private world. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the soft gray light from the windshield. The laughter faded, but the warmth in his eyes remained. "I've had a really great day, Scarlett," he said, his voice quiet. "Me too," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. He was honest. He was transparent. He saw the world in the same way I was learning to see it. He didn't try to fix me, he just walked beside me, pointing out the interesting light. And in that moment, sitting in a car with the rain washing the world clean outside, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd never feel again. Not just attraction, not just companionship. Hope. A delicate, terrifying, and beautiful hope for what could be. Time began to move in a new rhythm, a gentle, sun-dappled cadence. The frantic, heart-hammering pace of my early days with Mark settled into something deep and steady. It was a rhythm built on Saturday morning pancakes with Leo, who had taken to Mark with the uncomplicated trust of a child. Mark never tried to be his father. He was just Mark, the guy who knew cool facts about volcanoes, could identify any bird by its song, and always had a spare lens cap for Leo's beginner camera. It was built on Sunday afternoons spent in our modern apartment in the city. The space was filled with light and our combined lives. My architectural award sat on the shelf next with his photojournalism trophies. My neat, labeled boxes of slides and negatives were stacked beside his chaotic, but somehow organized, hard drives. Leo's artwork was taped to the refrigerator. It was a home that felt authentically, messily lived in, not just designed. We fell into the comfortable, worn groove of a shared life. Our dates were often weekend road trips with no destination. We'd pack a picnic, throw our cameras in the back, and just drive. We'd end up on a misty beach, or at the foot of a mountain trail, or in a sleepy town with a single blinking stoplight. We'd take pictures, sometimes together, sometimes wandering off on our own, only to reconvene and share what we'd found. A perfect spiderweb jeweled with rain, the peeling paint on an old barn, the way the light hit a field of wheat. It was on one of these trips, a year after we'd met in that bookstore, that it happened. We were on the Olympic Peninsula, at a lake so still it perfectly mirrored the snow-capped peaks and the ancient evergreens. It was our place, a spot we'd return to again and again, in every season. That day, the air was crisp, the sky a clear, aching blue. Leo was skipping stones at the water's edge, his laughter echoing across the silent lake. Mark and I were setting up our tripods, the familiar, comfortable silence between us. I was focusing on the perfect reflection of the mountains, trying to capture the impossible clarity of the water. "Hey, Scarlett," Mark said, his voice soft. I turned from my viewfinder. He wasn't looking at the landscape. He was looking at me, his camera hanging by his side. His expression was serious, but his eyes were full of a warm, unwavering light. "Yeah?" He took a step closer, reaching into the pocket of his jacket. My breath hitched. I knew. Somehow, in the deepest part of me, I knew what was coming. He didn't get down on one knee. The gesture was more him than that. He simply took my hand, his fingers warm and familiar around mine. He held out a small, simple wooden box. "I was trying to think of the perfect way to do this," he began, his voice a little rough with emotion. "I thought about a grand gesture, a fancy dinner, but that didn't feel right. This feels right. Here, with you, with Leo, with all this," he gestured to the majestic, silent beauty around us. "This is our life. It's real, and it's messy, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever been a part of." He opened the box. Nestled inside wasn't a traditional diamond. It was a unique, raw gemstone, its surface uncut but polished to a soft gleam. It was set in a simple band of reclaimed wood and platinum. It was earthy, unique, and utterly perfect. "You taught me that the most beautiful things aren't always the perfect, polished ones," he said, his eyes holding mine. "They're the real ones. The strong ones, the ones with a story. You are the strongest, most beautiful story I know. Scarlett, will you marry me? Will you let me be a part of your story, and Leo's, forever?" Tears welled in my eyes, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. I looked over at Leo, who had stopped skipping stones and was watching us with a huge, hopeful grin on his face. He gave me 2 thumbs up. I looked back at Mark, at this good, honest, transparent man who had walked into my life when it was nothing but rubble and had helped me see the beauty in rebuilding. He hadn't just given me love, he had given me back my sense of self. My voice was thick with emotion, but clear and sure. "Yes," I whispered, then louder, laughing through the tears. "Yes, of course I will." He slid the ring onto my finger. It felt like it had always belonged there. He pulled me into his arms, and we held each other, surrounded by the mirrored perfection of the lake and the mountains, a small, complete unit of three. The click of a camera shutter broke the silence. We turned to see Leo, holding his camera, having captured the moment himself. It wasn't an end to the story. It was a new chapter. The foundation was no longer one I was building alone. It was something we were creating together, strong, real, and built to last. The sound that filled our modern apartment was laughter. Unfettered, joyful, chaotic laughter. It mixed with the scent of vanilla frosting and the warm afternoon light streaming through the large windows that looked out over the Seattle skyline. On the floor of the living room, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and new toys, sat my son, our son, Leo, and his father, Daniel. They were building a ridiculously complex Lego spaceship, their heads bent together in concentration. Across the room, Mark was handing my mother a cup of tea, making her laugh with a quiet story. My sister was debating the merits of different camera lenses with one of Mark's friends from his photojournalism days. The room was a tapestry of my old life and my new one, woven together not perfectly, but comfortably. It was messy and real, and ours, and ours. Our wedding had been small, just family and a few close friends at the very lake where he'd proposed. Leo had been the ring bearer, beaming with pride. I'd worn a simple ivory dress, and Mark had cried when he saw me. There were no ghosts at the ceremony, only the solid, joyful presence of our future. I stood at the kitchen island, finishing the decoration on Leo's birthday cake. It was a masterpiece of lopsided layers and slightly smeared blue frosting, a far cry from the architecturally perfect desserts I would have felt compelled to make in my previous life. This one was made with love and laughter, and it was perfect because of its imperfections. Mark came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. "It's a great cake," he murmured, kissing my neck. "It's a mess," I laughed, leaning back into his solid warmth. "It's our mess," he corrected softly. And he was right. This was the family I had now. It wasn't the one I had once blueprinted for my life. It was better. It was earned. It was built on a foundation of honesty, forged in the fire of heartbreak, and strengthened by patience and choice. Daniel was not my enemy, he was Leo's father, and we had learned, through pain and necessity, how to be partners in that, if in nothing else. Later, after the cake had been devoured and the goodbyes had been said, the three of us, Mark, Leo, and I, were left in the peaceful, contented quiet of the evening. The setting sun painted the walls in shades of gold and orange. Leo was dozing on the sofa, exhausted from his celebrations. Mark picked up my camera from the side table. "Hey," he said softly, "let's get a picture. The three of us." He set the timer and propped the camera on a bookshelf. He came to the sofa, gently rousing Leo and pulling him onto his lap. I squeezed in beside them, wrapping my arm around them both. We were a tangle of limbs and love, smiling at the lens. The camera flashed, capturing us, a little tired, a little messy, completely and utterly happy. I looked at the preview on the screen. It wasn't a technically perfect photo. Someone's eyes were half closed, my hair was a bit out of place, and a smear of blue frosting was still visible on Leo's cheek. But it was us. It was real. It was our masterpiece. I had spent my life designing structures meant to last. But the most enduring thing I would ever build wasn't made of steel and glass. It was made of patience and forgiveness and the courage to open my heart again. It was this quiet, joyful noise on a Sunday afternoon. It was the family I had chosen, and the family that had chosen me back. The upgrade was complete. Not to a newer version of my old life, but to a wholly new, brilliantly imperfect, and breathtakingly beautiful one.